So here's a question. How do you want to die? And which people would you like to be around you when you eventually go? What kind of person would you like them to be? Do you care if they come from the same part of the world as you? Do you care if they speak the same language? Do you care if they have the same religion? What about the people looking after you? Do they need to have the same cultural background? And if you decide the answer is yes, and you want to build a little enclave of fellow old people who have had similar experiences to you, then how would the rest of the world react to having that in their midst? These are some of the questions that you might find yourself asking and that the characters have to address in Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens by Shankari Chandran, which is a new Australian novel and a pretty interesting one. The gist of it is that Cinnamon Gardens is a nursing home in the fictitious suburb of West Grove, Sydney. It is run by an elderly Sri Lankan woman who also lives there. She's Sri Lankan Australian, but she was a refugee of the Sri Lankan Civil War. And having moved here and started this nursing home, a lot of the other residents are Sri Lankans as well. And the novel explores life at the nursing home, which is, sometimes sad, sometimes funny. There's a really good mixture there. But it also explores how the outside world reacts to this, how the rest of West Grove reacts to having this sort of primarily Sri Lankan nursing home right in the middle of Sydney. As you can imagine, racism is a big theme in the book, but there's also some interesting questions about what othering is and to what extent we should allow people to... Yeah, this is a tricky book to explain, but it's a really interesting one to read. I would recommend it. This is a recommendation from me. Firstly, the writing itself is beautiful. I could live 1,000 years and never quite manage to put together sentences as beautiful as some of the ones in this book. Secondly, the characters are both interesting and real, but there's a really good variety of them. So it does the kind of Big Little Lies thing, or actually I think I'm thinking of a different Leon Moriarty book, but the sort of jumping of perspectives from one character to another to another to another. And what it does really well is every character seems like a jerk except when you are viewing things from their perspective, at which point everyone else seems like a jerk. So Shankari Chandran has done a really good job of getting into the heads of these characters and putting kind of thoughts and views and experiences into their heads that feel really kind of raw and honest. On the other hand, though, obviously authors are motivated to write books not just for the money, because the money is sometimes hard to come by, but there are easier ways to make money, is I guess what I'm saying. But usually they have particular ideas or themes that they want to explore, right? And in this case, so this is a book about racism, it's a book about religion, it's a book about aged care, it's a book about a lot of different things. And perhaps as a consequence of that, sometimes it feels like the themes are dragging the characters around as opposed to the characters driving the themes. For example, there's this wonderful character named Ruben who is a nurse at the aged care centre, Cinnamon Gardens, and he early on is attacked by some racists in an alleyway, and he fights them off and in fact manages to grab one and then performs a citizenship test on them by kind of the guy he's grabbed. He just breaks their fingers one by one every time they get a question wrong on his impromptu Australian citizenship test. So that was a really cool scene. But the point is that the book in general, Ruben is uniformly described as this sort of gentle soul, this aged care nurse. And it didn't feel like he was a gentle soul who was harboring a violent streak. What that scene felt like is that the author wanted to make the point that a lot of these sort of true blue Aussie Southern Cross get out of my country types wouldn't actually pass an Australian citizenship test. And that's a really interesting point to make, but it didn't seem to fit with Ruben's character. Similarly, there's another character named Gareth who I enjoyed reading about. He was one of those ones where you can tell... So I really like books where the characters kind of walk on the tightrope of being a bad person but also a sympathetic character. As you can imagine, this is something that interests me in particular. But so the Gareth character, there's a scene early on where he's a local councillor, right, in this fictitious suburb of Western Sydney, Westgrove, and he is in a meeting where he is the only person who kind of, everyone else at the meeting talks about the Sri Lankans and the Australians, and Gareth is the one who points out that actually you mean Sri Lankan Australians or Southeast Asian Australians, because these are all Australian citizens we're talking about. Whereas other people in the meeting clearly see the people of a Sri Lankan background as outsiders who they don't necessarily need to care about. And Gareth also has this little sort of mental thing he goes through about how white women are even worse than white men because they don't notice the privilege that they have or something. And he's mentally quoting somebody else. But the point is, Gareth is kind of the most woke person in that meeting. Later in the book, Gareth loses his mind over a Captain Cook statue that was removed 40 years earlier, and he sort of becomes suddenly incensed by this. And the author definitely makes an effort to kind of charting Gareth's mental breakdown, but it really did feel more like an excuse to talk about the way people are so attached to Captain Cook unreasonably than something that Gareth in particular would experience. So yeah, themes dragging characters around was kind of my objection. Having said all that though, this feels like a book that is maybe designed more to educate than to entertain. Yeah. And I really deeply respect that, because I think one of the things that's wonderful about fiction is that we can learn something from it. And I personally, in primary school and high school, I got to learn about the American Civil War. I got to learn about Henry VIII and all the wives he butchered. I was never taught anything about the Sri Lankan Civil War, right? So this is something that a lot of Australians, particularly white Australians, wouldn't know anything about. And exploring it through fiction is a totally legit thing to do. I need to warn you up front that it doesn't necessarily have... I don't want to spoil the ending, but I do want to say that it leaves quite a lot of things unresolved in terms of interpersonal conflicts. And so thematically, it's funny because books that have happy endings don't change the world, right? Because the reader gets the catharsis from the happy ending, and then they are not motivated to go out there and do things differently. So stories with happy endings, they can be enjoyable, but they very rarely bring about social change. That can only happen from tragic endings, I think, which is one of the reasons that literary fiction very rarely has a happy ending. This is not that though. This ending isn't pure tragedy or pure comedy or pure anything else, but it does leave kind of a lot of unanswered questions kind of hovering over it, possibly because the book tackles so much in it. So if you're not the kind of person who enjoys that, then I would not recommend this book. But if you are the sort of person who's willing to tolerate that, and you would like to learn a little bit about not just Sri Lankan culture, but also Australian culture and how Australian culture reacts to other cultures, and if you want to discover just some really interesting characters and all that stuff and read some beautiful writing, then I would 100% recommend Chai Time at Cinnamon Gardens. So thanks very much for watching. I've been Jack Heath. If you enjoyed this video and you want me to make more, by the way, please like and subscribe and do all that stuff. I have no clue whether people actually want me to spend my time making these videos or if they'd rather I just write new books. I am doing that for the record, but every time I read a book, I would like to... I used to review them on Goodreads and no one really read my reviews. So I hear BookTube is a thing, so here I am doing a BookTube thing. Next time I will probably be talking about Who Gets to Be Smart by Bree Lee. You might be sensing a theme here, but I swear it's just coincidence. So who gets to be smart? The answer may surprise you. I will see you next week.